Good morning, sir. My name is Mohammed Zamira. My roll number is 219518041. I'm from EC Department B section. Today my topic is origin of the resting potential. Introduction. A relatively static membrane's potential, which is usually referred as the ground value for the transmembrane voltage. The relatively static membrane's potential of a concentric cell is called the resting membrane's potential or resting voltage, as opposed to the specific dynamic electrochemical phenomena called action potential and grabbed membrane's potential. Apart in glands, membrane's voltage in the majority of non-excitable cells can also undergo changes in response to environmental or intercellular stimuli. The resting potential exists due to the difference in the membrane's permeability for potassium, sodium, calcium, and chloride ions, which in turn results from functional activity of various ion channels, ion transporters, and exchangers. Conventionally, resting membranes potentials can be defined as a relatively stable ground value of transmembrane voltage in animal and plant cells. Electroneutrality. In most quantitative treatments of membrane potential, such as derivations of Goldman equation, electroneutrality is assumed that there is no measurable charge excess on either side of the membranes. So, although there is an electric potential across the membranes due to charge separation, there is no actual membrane difference in the global concentration of positive and negative ion across the membranes. That is, there is no actual measurable charge excess on either side. The that occurs because of the effect of charge on electrochemical potential is usually greater than the effect of concentration. So, an undetectable change in concentration creates a great change in electric potential. K plus An, K plus An minus, K plus An minus. Generation of the resting potential. Cell membranes are typical permeable to only a subset of ions. These usually include potassium ions, chloride ions, bicarbonate ions, and others. To simplify the descriptions of the ion basis of the resting membrane potential, it is most useful to consider only one ion species at first and consider the others later, since plasma membrane potentials are most also determined primarily by potassium permeability. That is where to start. Panel 1 of the diagram shows a diagrammatical representation of a simple cell where a concentrating gradient has already been established. This panel is drawn as if the membrane has no permeability to an ion. There is no membrane potential because despite there being a concentration gradient for potassium, there is no net charge imbalance across the membranes. If the membranes were to become permeable to a type of ion that is more concentrate on one side of the membranes, then that ion would contribute to membrane voltage because the permanent ions would move across the membranes with the net movement of the ion type down the concentration gradient. There would be net movement from the side of the membranes with a higher concentrations of the ion to the side with lower concentrations. Such a movement of one ion across the membranes would result in net imbalance of charge across the membranes and a membrane's potential. This is common mechanisms by which many cells establish a membrane potential. Panel 2. In panel 2 of the diagram, the cell membranes has been made permeable to potassium ions, but not the anions inside the cells. These anions are mostly contributed by proteins. There is energy stored in the potassium ion concentration gradient that can be converted into an electrical gradient. When potassium ions move out of the cell, note the potassium ions can move across the membranes in both directions, but the purely statistical process that arises from the higher concentration of potassium ions inside the cell, there will be more potassium ions moving out of the cell. Because there is a higher concentration of potassium ions inside the cell, their random molecular motion is more likely to encounter the permeability pore. That is case for the potassium ions that are outside and at lower concentration. An internal K plus is simply more likely to leave the cell than an extracellular K plus into enter it. It is a matter of diffusion, doing work by dissipating the concentration gradient. As potassium leaves, as potassium leaves the cell, this charge separations creates a transmembrane voltage. This transmembrane voltage is the membrane potential. As potential contributes to leave the cell, separates more charges. The membrane potentials will continue to grow. The length of the arrows represents the magnitude of the potassium ion moments due to the each form of energy. The directions of the arrow indicates the directions in which the particular force is applied. Thus, the building membrane's voltage is an increasing force that acts counter to the tendency for net movement of potassium ions down the potassium concentration gradient. Panel 3. In panel 3, the membrane's voltage has grown to the extent that its strength now matches the concentration gradients. Since these forces are now the same strength and orient in opposite direction, the systems is now in equilibrium. Put another way, the tendency of the potassium to leave the cell by running down its concentration gradient is now matched by the tendency of the membrane's voltage to the pull potassium ion back into the cell. K plus continues to move across the membranes, but the rate at which it enters and leaves the cells are the same. Thus, there is no net potassium current because K plus is at equilibrium. Membrane potential is stable or resting. E power K. In a healthy animal cell, Na plus permeability is about 5% of the K plus permeability or even less, whereas the respective reversal potentials are plus 60 MV for sodium and minus 60 MV for potassium. Thus, the membrane's potential will not be right at Ek, but rather depolarized from Ek by an amount of approximately 5% of 140 MV difference between Ek and ENA. Thus, the cell's resting potentials will be about minus 75 MV. In a more formal notation, the membrane's potential is the uh, weightage average of each contributing ion's equilibrium potential, the size of each weight in the relative conductance of each ion. In the normal case, where three ions contribute to the membrane's potentials, M is equals to Gk plus by GTOT Ek, where Em is the membranes of the potentials measured in volts. Ex is the equilibrium potentials per ion x, also in volts. Gx or GTOT is the relative conductance of ion X, which is dimensionless. GTTO is the total conductance of all permanent ions in arbitrary units. In case GK, GN, GCl, membranes transport proteins. For determinations of membrane potentials, the two most important types of membrane ions transport proteins or ion channels and ion transporters. Ion channel proteins create paths across cell membranes through which ions can passively diffuse without direct expenditure of the metabolic energy they have selectively for certain ions. Thus, there are potassium, chloride, and sodium selectively ion channels. Different cells and even different parts of these cells will have different amount of various ion transport proteins. Typically, the amount of the certain potassium channels is most important for the control of the resting potential. Some ion forms such as the Na plus, K plus, KT plus are the electrogenic, that is they produce charge imbalance across the cell membranes and can also contribute directly to the membrane's potentials. Most forms use metabolic energy to the function. Equilibrium potential. For most animal cells, potassium ions are the most important for the resting potential due to the active transport of potassium ions. The concentration of potassium is higher inside cells than outside. Most cells have potassium selective ion channels, proteins that remains open all the time. There will be net movement of the positively charged potassium ions through these potassium channels with a resulting accumulations of excess negative charge inside of the cell. The outward movement of positively charged potassium ions is due to the random molecular motion and continues until enough excess negative charge accumulates inside the cell or form a membrane potential which can balance the difference in the concentration of potassium between inside and outside of the cells. EQK is the equilibrium potential for potassium measured in volts. R is the universal gas constant equal to the 8.31 joules. K moles. T is the absolute temperature measured in Kelvin. Z is the number of elementary charge of the ions in question involved in the reactions. F is the Faraday constant equal to the 96,485 coulombs. K plus 0 is the extracellular concentration of potassium measured in moles. K is the likewise the intercellular concentration of potassium. For common usage, the Nernst equation is often given in a simple form by assuming typical human body temperature, reducing constants and switching to log base. The units used for concentration are unimportant as they will cancel out into a ratio for potassium at normal body temperature. One may calculate the equilibrium potassium in millivolts as this resetting potential. The resetting membrane's potential is not an equilibrium potential as it lies on the constant expenditure of the energy for its maintenance. It is a dynamic diffusion uh, potential that takes this mechanism uh, into account, wholly unlike the pillow's equilibrium potential, which is true no matter the nature of the system. Under consideration, the resting membrane's potential is dominated by the ionic species in the system that has the greatest conductance across the membranes for most cells in the potassium, as potassium is also the ion with the most negative equilibrium potentials. Usually, the resting potentials can be no more negative than the potassium equilibrium potential. This equation resembles the Nernst equation, but as a term of each permanent ion. Also, Z has been inserted into the equation, causing the intercellular and extracellular concentration of Cl minus to be reversed relative to K plus and Na plus, as chloride's negative charge is handled by inverting the fractions inside the logarithm term. Em is the membrane's potentials measured in volts R, T, and Fr as above. Ps is the relative permeability of the ions in the concentration of ions in the compartment Y as above. Another way to view the membrane potentials, considering instead of conductance of the ion channel rather than the permeability of the membranes, is using the Millman equation, also called conductance equation, where GTO is the combined conductance of all ion species. Again, in arbitrary units, the later equations portrays the resting membrane's potentials as a weighted average of the reversal potentials of the system, where the weights are the relative conductance of each ion species. During the action potentials, these weights changes. If the conductance of Na plus and Cl minus are zero, the membrane's potentials reduces to the Nernst potentials of K plus. Measuring resting potentials. In some cells, membrane's potentials is always changing. For such cells, there is never as rest, and the resting potentials is a theoretical concept. Other cells with little in the way of membrane transport functions that change in time have a resting membrane's potentials that can be measured by inserting an electrode into the cell. Transmembrane potentials can also be measured optically with the dyes that change their optical properties according to the membrane's potentials. Summary of the resting potential values in different types of cells. Astrologia minus 80 to 90 MV. Neuron minus 60 to minus 70 MV. Smooth muscle cells minus 60 MV. Ortho smooth muscle tissues minus 45 MV. Hair cells 15 to 40 MV. Proto-rector cells minus 40 MV. Erythrocytes minus 8.4 MV. Thank you for giving me this wonderful opportunity.